Welcome to Night Thinker, where we explore the ideas that shaped our world, softly, slowly, and with care. Tonight, we're going to examine one of the most fundamental questions in all of philosophy. A question so basic, so obvious, that most people never stop to think about it. And yet, when you do stop to think about it, when you really examine it closely, the answer becomes far less certain than you might expect. The question is simple. When one thing causes another thing to happen, what exactly is taking place? It sounds trivial. Fire burns cotton. A ball hits another ball and makes it move. The sun rises and the day begins. Cause and effect. We see it everywhere, every moment of our lives. But 600 years before one of the Western world's most celebrated philosophers questioned this obvious truth, a medieval Islamic scholar had already dismantled it completely. And his answer didn't just challenge philosophy. It hinted at something that wouldn't be confirmed until the 20th century, when quantum physics revealed that the universe itself operates on principles far stranger than common sense suggests. This is a story about two brilliant minds, separated by 6 centuries and vastly different worlds, who arrived at nearly identical conclusions about the nature of reality. It's a story about how knowledge travels across time and culture. And it's a story about how the simplest questions can lead to the most profound insights. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's think together about fire and cotton, and the invisible threads that seem to connect everything in the universe. To understand this story, we need to travel back almost 1,000 years. The year is 1095. If you were living in Europe at this time, your world would be small, poor, and uncertain. The great Roman Empire had collapsed centuries ago. Learning was scarce. Books were rare. Most knowledge from the ancient Greeks had been lost or forgotten. What we now call the Dark Ages wasn't quite as dark as popular history sometimes suggests, but it was certainly a time of intellectual stagnation in the West. But if you were in the Islamic world during this same period, you would be living through something very different. A golden age, an explosion of learning, science, and philosophy that would shape human knowledge for centuries to come. The great cities of the Islamic Empire, Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, Cordoba, were centers of intellectual life unlike anything in Europe at the time. Scholars were translating works from Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit. They were developing algebra and advancing astronomy. They were performing surgeries, building libraries, and debating questions of theology and philosophy with a sophistication that wouldn't reach Western Europe for hundreds of years. And in this world, at the most prestigious university in Baghdad, a man in his late 30s held one of the most honored teaching positions in the entire Islamic intellectual tradition. His name was Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali was, by any measure, exceptional. He had mastered Islamic jurisprudence, the complex legal tradition that governed Muslim life. He understood theology deeply, the rational arguments for belief, and the challenges skeptics raised against it. He had studied Greek philosophy, particularly the works of Aristotle as interpreted by earlier Muslim thinkers like Avicenna. And he was known as a brilliant teacher, someone who could make complex ideas clear and compelling. By his mid-30s, he had achieved what most scholars spend their entire lives pursuing: recognition, respect, prestige, and intellectual influence. But something was bothering him. Something fundamental. Something that, the more he examined it, the less sense it made. The question concerned causation. The idea that one thing makes another thing happen. Now, this might seem like an odd thing to worry about. We experience causation constantly. You drop a glass, it falls and shatters. You touch a hot stove, you feel pain. You light a match, fire appears. Cause and effect. It's the most basic pattern in our experience of reality. But Al-Ghazali, trained in logic and philosophy, started asking a question that philosophers had debated since ancient Greece. What exactly is the connection between cause and effect? Where does it exist? How does it work? He focused on a specific example, one that would become famous in the history of philosophy: fire and cotton. When fire touches cotton, the cotton burns. Everyone knows this. Everyone has seen it. It happens every single time. Fire's nature is to burn. Cotton's nature is to be combustible. So when they meet, burning occurs. Simple, obvious, undeniable. Or is it? Al-Ghazali said, wait. Let's think about this carefully. When you observe fire touching cotton, what exactly do you see? You see fire approaching the cotton. That's the first event. Then you see the moment of contact. Fire and cotton touching. That's the second event. Then you see the cotton burning. That's the third event. 3 distinct events happening in sequence. Now here's the question. Where in this sequence do you actually see the causation happening? Where do you observe the fire making the cotton burn? Where is the connection, the power, the force that links these events together? You don't see it. You can't observe it. What you observe is simply this. Event A happens. Then event B happens. Then event C happens. One thing, then another thing, then another thing. You assume that the first event caused the third. But that's an assumption, an interpretation. It's not something you directly observe. All you truly observe is a sequence. Events following one another in time. Al-Ghazali pushed this further. He asked his students and readers to try a thought experiment. Think about the concept of fire. Really think about it. What is fire? It's heat, light, a chemical reaction. Whatever your definition, fire is one thing. Now think about the concept of cotton. Fabric made from cotton plants. Soft, flammable material. That's another thing. These are 2 completely separate concepts. 2 distinct ideas. There's nothing in the definition of fire that logically requires cotton to burn. There's nothing in the definition of cotton that logically requires it to burn when fire touches it. The connection between them is not a matter of logic. It's not a necessary truth, like saying, all bachelors are unmarried, or triangles have 3 sides. Those are logically necessary. The definitions make them true. But fire burns cotton. That's different. You could imagine, without contradicting yourself, without breaking the laws of logic, a universe where fire touches cotton and nothing happens. Strange, yes. Unexpected, certainly. But logically impossible? No. It's not like imagining a triangle with 4 sides. That's genuinely impossible. A triangle, by definition, has 3 sides. Change that, and it's not a triangle anymore. But fire not burning cotton? That's just unusual, not logically impossible. So if the connection between fire and burning cotton isn't logically necessary, where does it come from? This is where Al-Ghazali's answer becomes radical. He said, the connection comes from God's custom, God's habit. Every single moment, God is creating these events side by side. Fire here, burning there. Not because one causes the other in any mechanical sense, but because God chooses to conjoin them continuously, moment after moment after moment. The universe, in Al-Ghazali's view, doesn't run on its own. It doesn't have built-in mechanical laws that operate independently. Instead, every instant of existence is a fresh act of divine creation. God sustains the patterns we observe. Fire usually burns cotton because that's God's custom, his consistent pattern of action. But that pattern isn't necessary. God could, if he chose, bring fire and cotton together and not create burning. That would be a miracle, not a violation of nature's laws, but a change in God's customary pattern. This view is called occasionalism. The idea that what we call causes are merely occasions for God to act. Fire doesn't really burn cotton. God burns cotton on the occasion of fire touching it. To modern ears, especially secular modern ears, this might sound like religious mysticism, an attempt to put God at the center of everything, even things that don't need divine explanation. But Al-Ghazali wasn't being mystical. He was being logical, rigorously, devastatingly logical. He had identified a genuine problem. We assume causation exists, but we never actually observe it. We see correlation. We see constant conjunction. We see patterns. But the causal connection itself, the thing that supposedly makes one event produce another, that remains invisible, unobservable, and logically uncertain. His solution was to say, if we can't observe it, and it's not logically necessary, then perhaps it doesn't exist the way we think it does. Perhaps what we call causation is really just the consistent will of God, maintaining the patterns that allow us to navigate the world. And with that argument, Al-Ghazali had planted a seed that would grow, quietly and invisibly, for the next 600 years. Let's jump forward now. 6 centuries have passed. The world has changed dramatically. The Islamic Golden Age has faded. The Renaissance has swept through Europe. The scientific revolution has transformed how people think about the natural world. Newton has explained gravity. Telescopes and microscopes have revealed new realms of reality. The age of reason, the Enlightenment, is in full swing. And in Scotland, a man named David Hume is about to publish a book that will shock the philosophical establishment. Hume was a different kind of thinker than Al-Ghazali. Where Al-Ghazali was a theologian defending faith, Hume was a skeptic questioning everything, including religion. Where Al-Ghazali worked within the Islamic intellectual tradition, Hume was part of the European Enlightenment's rebellion against traditional authority. But despite these vast differences, despite coming from completely different worlds, Hume was about to make almost exactly the same argument Al-Ghazali had made 600 years earlier. In 1748, Hume published An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And in this book, he took aim at one of philosophy's most fundamental assumptions, the idea that we can know, with certainty, that one thing causes another. Hume's approach was similar to Al-Ghazali's, though he used different examples. Imagine, Hume said, 2 billiard balls on a table. One ball is rolling toward the other. It strikes the second ball. The second ball begins to move. We say, without hesitation, that the first ball caused the second ball to move. The collision made it happen. Cause and effect. Obvious. But Hume asked, what exactly did you observe? You saw the first ball moving. You saw the moment of contact. You saw the second ball begin moving. Just like Al-Ghazali's fire and cotton. 3 events in sequence. But where, Hume asked, did you see the causation? Where did you observe the first ball making the second ball move? Where is this mysterious power, this force of causation that supposedly connects these events. You didn't see it. You can't see it. What you observed was simply constant conjunction. Events happening together, repeatedly, over and over again. Every time ball A hits ball B moves. Every single time. But that's not the same as seeing causation itself. That's just seeing a pattern, a correlation, a consistent sequence. Hume pushed this analysis further, just as Al-Ghazali had. He said, think about what you know before you've ever seen billiard balls collide. Could you predict, just from understanding what a billiard ball is, that when one strikes another, the second will move? No. There's nothing in the concept. Solid spherical object that logically entails will transfer motion when struck. You have to observe it happening to learn that pattern. The connection isn't logically necessary. It's empirically observed, which means it's based on experience, not on reason. And here's where Hume's argument becomes truly devastating. He said, every time you've observed billiard balls in the past, they behave the same way. Collision leads to movement. Always. Without exception. But does that prove that the next time you observe a collision, the same thing will happen? No. Logically, it doesn't prove anything. The fact that the sun has risen every single day of your life doesn't logically prove that it will rise tomorrow. The fact that bread has always nourished you doesn't logically prove that the next piece of bread won't poison you. The fact that fire has always burned cotton doesn't prove that it must burn cotton next time. All you have is past experience, pattern recognition, habit. We believe the future will resemble the past. We believe that patterns will continue. We expect causation to work the way it always has. But this belief, Hume argued, is not based on logic. It's not based on reason. It's based on psychological conditioning, custom, habit. The human mind's tendency to expect patterns to continue. In other words, we believe in causation not because we can prove it exists, but because we're built to assume it exists. It's a mental habit formed by repeated experience. This argument shocked the philosophical world, and it still does. Hume had identified what's now called the problem of induction, the problem of how we can justify moving from past observations to future predictions, how we can rationally believe that patterns will continue. His answer was unsettling. We can't. Not rationally. We just do it anyway, because our minds work that way. Now, here's the remarkable thing. If you compare Al-Ghazali's argument to Hume's argument, they're nearly identical in structure. Both observe that when we see cause and effect, we're really only seeing constant conjunction, events paired together consistently. Both recognize that there's no logical necessity connecting cause and effect, no inherent force or power that we can observe directly. Both concluded that our belief in causation is based on repeated experience, not on rational proof or direct observation. The difference, the crucial difference, is what they concluded from this analysis. Al-Ghazali said, this constant conjunction comes from God's will. God creates these patterns. God maintains them. We can rely on them because God is consistent, but they're not independent of God. They're sustained by divine action. Hume said, this constant conjunction is just a brute fact about our experience. We observe patterns. We develop expectations. But there's no deeper explanation, no guarantee, no metaphysical foundation, just habit and custom. For Al-Ghazali, the answer to where does causation come from was God. For Hume, The answer was, it doesn't really exist the way you think. It's just how your mind interprets repeated correlation. Two different conclusions, but the same fundamental insight. What we call causation is not what common sense assumes it is. And here's what makes this story even more remarkable. There's no evidence that Hume ever read Al-Ghazali. Latin translations of some Islamic philosophy existed in Europe by Hume's time, but Al-Ghazali's specific arguments about causation weren't widely known in 18th century Scotland. This means we're looking at convergent intellectual evolution. Two brilliant minds, separated by vast differences in culture, religion, time, and circumstance, independently arriving at nearly the same conclusion about one of philosophy's deepest questions. When this happens in science or philosophy, it's usually a sign that the insight is genuine, that there's something real there, something true, waiting to be discovered by anyone who looks carefully enough. The problem of causation isn't a cultural artifact. It's not a Western or Eastern question. It's a human question. A question that arises whenever someone stops to think carefully about the patterns we observe in reality. Al-Ghazali thought about it in 11th century Baghdad. Hume thought about it in 18th century Scotland. And both of them, in their own ways, realized that the answer is far more mysterious than it first appears. But the story doesn't end with Hume, because in the 20th century, something unexpected happened. Physicists, working at the smallest scales of reality, began discovering that the universe behaves in ways that seem to echo what Al-Ghazali and Hume had said about causation. In 1993, a chemistry professor named Karen Harding published an academic paper with a provocative title, Al-Ghazali's Occasionalism and the Copenhagen Interpretation of Quantum Mechanics. In this paper, Harding pointed out something that few people had noticed. Al-Ghazali's medieval philosophy bears a striking resemblance to one of the most widely accepted interpretations of quantum physics. Now, let's be clear about what we're not saying here. We're not saying that Al-Ghazali predicted quantum mechanics. That would be absurd. He knew nothing about atoms, particles, or the mathematical structures that physicists use to describe reality at tiny scales. But what Harding observed is that Al-Ghazali's philosophical framework, his way of understanding causation and reality, maps surprisingly well onto how modern physics describes the behavior of quantum systems. Let me explain what this means. In quantum mechanics, particles don't have definite properties until they're measured. Before measurement, a quantum particle exists in what's called a superposition of states. It's not in one definite state or another. It's in a kind of probabilistic cloud of possibilities. Only when you measure it, when you observe it, does it collapse into a definite state. This is deeply strange. It means that at the quantum level, reality is not deterministic in the way classical physics assumed. Things don't have definite properties just sitting there, independent of observation. Instead, they exist in probability distributions until something forces them into a particular state. Now think about Al-Ghazali's occasionalism. He said that things don't have independent natures that cause effects. Fire doesn't have an inherent power to burn. Cotton doesn't have an inherent property of combustibility that makes it burn when fire touches it. Instead, God creates these events, moment by moment, according to his custom. In Al-Ghazali's framework, there are no independent causal powers in nature. There are only consistent patterns of divine action. In quantum mechanics, there are no deterministic causal chains at the fundamental level. There are only probability distributions that resolve into definite outcomes when certain conditions are met. Do you see the parallel? Both frameworks deny that nature has built-in, necessary causal connections. Both suggest that what we observe as causation is actually something more fundamental and strange operating beneath the surface. Here's a concrete example. Drop a lead ball from your hand. It falls to the ground. Every time. Without fail. Classical physics says, the ball falls because of gravity. Gravity is a force. It pulls the ball downward. Cause and effect. Necessary and deterministic. Quantum mechanics says, the ball falls because the probability of it falling is extraordinarily high. Not 100% technically, but so close to 100% that in practice, it's indistinguishable from certainty. The probability of the ball spontaneously floating upward, or disappearing, or turning into a butterfly is not zero. It's just so absurdly, unimaginably small that it never happens in practice. But in principle, according to quantum mechanics, these bizarre outcomes are possible, just vanishingly unlikely. Al-Ghazali would say, the ball falls because that's God's custom. God could, if he chose, make the ball float upward instead. That would be a miracle. It doesn't happen because God maintains consistent patterns, but it's not impossible in principle. See the resemblance? Both quantum mechanics and Al-Ghazali's occasionalism replace deterministic necessity with something more flexible. For quantum mechanics, it's probability. For Al-Ghazali, it's divine will. But in both cases, the universe doesn't run on rigid, mechanical laws that couldn't be otherwise. Now, again, we need to be careful not to push this too far. Quantum mechanics is a scientific theory based on mathematics and experimental evidence. Al-Ghazali's occasionalism is a theological and philosophical position based on logical analysis and religious commitment. They're not the same thing, but the parallel is real and thought-provoking. Both frameworks challenge the common-sense view that nature has built-in causal powers. Both suggest that reality is stranger, more flexible, more fundamentally mysterious than everyday experience suggests. And both, in their own ways, vindicate Al-Ghazali's and Hume's insight. What we call causation might not be what we think it is. For centuries, scientists assumed that the universe was like a giant machine, billiard balls on a cosmic scale. Every event determined by prior causes, stretching back in an unbroken chain to the beginning of time. But quantum mechanics revealed that at the smallest scales, the universe doesn't work that way. Particles don't follow deterministic paths. Outcomes aren't rigidly determined. Probability is woven into the fabric of reality itself. This doesn't prove that Al-Ghazali was right about God's role in causation. But it does suggest that his intuition, that causation is stranger than it appears, was remarkably prescient. A medieval theologian and 20th century physics, separated by 900 years, both pointing toward the same unsettling conclusion: the patterns we observe in nature are real, but the necessity we assume underlies them might be an illusion. So where does all of this leave us? We've traveled from 11th century Baghdad to 18th century Scotland to 20th century physics labs. We've seen how two brilliant thinkers, worlds apart, arrived at the same insight about causation. And we've glimpsed how modern science has, in its own way, confirmed that the universe is stranger than common sense suggests. But what does this mean for us? For our lives, our understanding, our way of moving through the world? I think there are a few things worth reflecting on. First, this story reminds us that the deepest questions transcend culture, religion, and time. Al-Ghazali was a Muslim theologian in medieval Persia. Hume was a secular skeptic in Enlightenment Scotland. They came from different worlds, believed different things, served different purposes in their thinking. But when they looked carefully at the same question, when they thought rigorously about the nature of causation, they arrived at remarkably similar conclusions. This tells us something important. Truth isn't relative. Reality doesn't change based on who's looking at it. The structure of the universe, the logic of existence, these are things that anyone, anywhere, at any time, can investigate and discover. The history of ideas is often told as a story of the West. We're taught that philosophy begins with the Greeks, continues through European thinkers, and leads to modern science. The rest of the world is footnoted, if it appears at all. But that's not how knowledge actually works. Ideas emerge, independently and in dialogue, across cultures and centuries. What Al-Ghazali discovered in Baghdad wasn't rediscovered by Hume because Hume read Al-Ghazali. It was rediscovered because it's true. Because anyone who thinks carefully enough about causation will eventually confront the same puzzle. Second, this story illustrates the power of questioning the obvious. Fire burns cotton. Billiard balls move when struck. The sun rises every morning. These are the most basic, most obvious facts of experience. No one doubts them. No one thinks twice about them. But Al-Ghazali and Hume did think twice. They asked, what exactly are we observing? What assumptions are we making? Can we really know what we think we know? And by questioning the obvious, they uncovered something profound. They revealed that even the most basic patterns we rely on are, in a deep sense, mysterious. This is what philosophy does at its best. It doesn't just accept the world as it appears. It asks, why does it appear this way? What lies beneath the surface? What are we missing? And often, what we're missing is hidden in plain sight. In the things so obvious we never think to question them. Third, this story shows us that uncertainty doesn't have to be threatening. For Al-Ghazali, the uncertainty of causation pointed toward God. If nature doesn't run itself, if patterns require something to sustain them, then something could be divine will. For him, mystery was an opening toward faith. For Hume, the uncertainty of causation was simply a fact about the limits of human knowledge. We can't prove causation. We can't guarantee the future will resemble the past. But we go on believing anyway, because that's how our minds work. For him, mystery was a reminder of humility. For quantum physicists, the uncertainty at the heart of reality is just the way things are. Probability isn't a sign of ignorance. It's fundamental. And we've learned to work with it, to build technologies and theories around it. All three responses acknowledge the same basic truth. The universe is stranger than we thought. Causation is not what it seems. But from that truth, different people draw different conclusions. Some find God. Some find skepticism. Some find science. What matters is the willingness to look closely, to question, to admit when the answers are less clear than we'd like them to be. Finally, this story invites us to think about what we take for granted in our own lives. We assume the sun will rise tomorrow. We assume our next meal will nourish us. We assume that patterns will continue, that the world will keep making sense the way it always has. And maybe that's fine. Maybe those assumptions are practical necessities. Maybe we need them to function. But every now and then, it's worth pausing to remember these are assumptions. The connection between past and future, between cause and effect, between what we've experienced and what we expect, these connections are not as solid as they feel. The universe could surprise us. Patterns could break. What seemed certain could turn out to be contingent. That's not a reason for anxiety. It's a reason for humility, for wonder, for staying open to the possibility that reality is deeper, richer, and stranger than our everyday experience suggests. Al-Ghazali knew this in the 11th century. Hume knew it in the 18th century. Quantum physicists confirmed it in the 20th century. And now you know it too. Before we end tonight, I want to leave you with one last thought. The question we've been exploring, the nature of causation, might seem abstract, philosophical, removed from daily life. But in a way, it's the most practical question there is. Every plan you make assumes the future will resemble the past. Every decision you make rests on the belief that actions lead to consequences in predictable ways. Every relationship, every ambition, every hope depends on patterns continuing. And maybe they will. Probably they will. But Al-Ghazali and Hume remind us, that's faith, not certainty. It's trust in patterns, not proof of necessity. So perhaps, as you move through your days, you might hold your expectations a little more lightly. Appreciate the patterns while they last. Feel grateful for the reliability of the world, rather than taking it for granted. Because beneath the surface of everyday life, beneath the routines and regularities, there's something vast and mysterious at work. Something that Al-Ghazali called God's custom. Something that Hume called habit and expectation. Something that quantum mechanics calls probability. Whatever you call it, it's there. Hidden in the space between fire and burning. Between cause and effect. Between this moment and the next. And if you listen closely, if you think carefully, you can almost hear it. The whisper of uncertainty beneath certainty. The mystery at the heart of the ordinary. That's what philosophy offers. Not answers, always, but deeper questions. Better ways of wondering. Thank you for thinking with me tonight. This has been Night Thinker. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with wonder.